Hello and welcome. In this video, I'm going to explain how to use error handling in Excel VBA. Now, error handling is a topic that causes a lot of confusion because it is very difficult to find a good explanation anywhere. And in this video, I'm going to explain error handling in a way that anybody can understand. Now, the first thing when we're dealing with error handling is that we want to have the correct setting. So we go to Tools, Options, and click on the General tab. Now, if you look at the right hand side and you see the error trapping section, you can see we've got three options. So by default, you should have break on unhandled errors. Now, it's important to have this set or otherwise the error handling code won't work as expected. So once we've got this set, let's go ahead and let's get started looking at error handling. So error handling is all about dealing with errors when the code is running, or what we call runtime errors. Now, there is a bit of confusion between runtime errors and compile errors. So let's understand the difference first of all. So compile error is when the code isn't written correctly, but it's more than one line, for example. So imagine we have an if statement and we say if one, then do something. So that statement, the syntax is actually fine, but there's no corresponding end if. So if we run this code here, you can see that it says block if without end if, but it's a compile error. Now, the reason this is a compile error is that VBA goes to the start of this procedure and then it tries to compile the code and make sure that it's valid. And if the code is valid, it'll run, but if it's not valid, it will show the compile error. So this is different than a runtime error. Now, we shouldn't have any compile errors in our code when it runs, and how we get rid of them is by using debug compile. Now, you can see that it's grayed out here, but if you want to put it in, you just press enter or something like this, make some kind of change, and then we do compile and it tells us block if without end if. So now we fixed that error, we do debug compile again. It didn't find any errors that time, so we know that we're good to go. Now, other type of errors are things like a for loop without a next, if we call a sub and the sub doesn't exist, or the name has been changed or something like that. So all those type of errors that don't make sense before we run the code. So VBA will figure them out. And VBA will also find any syntax errors. So always before the code runs, we should make sure there's no compile errors left. Now let's have a look at what a runtime error is. So imagine we write some code like this. We say dim total as long. So it's a long integer. And then when we run the code, we're going to place a value in the code. Now, in this case, it's a constant and it's always going to be text. But VBA doesn't judge at this point because VBA doesn't know what's going to happen in the code in between. So as far as VBA is concerned, the syntax is fine. But when we run this code, it's going to give us an error because it's going to attempt to put text into a long. So we run this code and you can see that it said type mismatch. This is because we've tried to put text into a number. Now, another type of error that we can get that would cause the same type of problem is that imagine we want to get the worksheet. So we do dim sheet as worksheet and we set the sheet equal to this workbook and the worksheets. So we're getting a worksheet and we're going to say sheet 2. Now at this point, because sheet 2 is just text, VBA doesn't judge if it's right or if it's wrong. It's only when the code runs that VBA will check. And when the code runs, VBA will look in the worksheets collection to give us back a worksheet. Now if it can't do what we asked it, it will give us an error instead. So you can see it gives a subscript out of range. And subscript out of range means we've looked for something in a collection or an array or something like this and it doesn't exist. So this is what runtime errors are. Essentially, we're asking VBA to run some kind of function and it can't give us the result we want, so it gives us back an error. Whenever a runtime error occurs in VBA, then VBA does one of three things based on our settings. So we've seen one of them before. So let's press F5 to run the code. So what it does is it gives us an error like this. Now we can click end if we want to end, or we can click debug to stop on the line with the code. And then you can see that we stop on the line and we can examine the code. So this behavior is the default behavior, and this behavior is the same as setting the behavior by using onError go to 0. So onError go to 0, what that means is to stop on the current line. Now there's two more bits of behavior that we can use. So it's always in one of the states, and the other one we can say is onError resume next. And what happens with onError resume next is that when an error occurs, so onError resume next, it'll just ignore the error and keep going. And the third one is onError go to, and we give it a label. So EH is a label, I haven't created it yet, and this is the label here. So onError, we want to go to EH. And let's just print out the error at this point. So debug, I will say debug.print and error.description. And if it doesn't, for example, if it doesn't get thrown, then what happens is it just exits the sub. So let's step through the code. You can see the error is about to happen, and when the error happens, it jumps down and prints out the description. So you can see that it printed out the description there, subscript out of range. So let's recap on these three items and then we'll look at them in turn. So the default is onError go to 0, and this will stop on the line with the error. The next one is onError resume next, and this will ignore the error. And the third one is onError go to a specified label, and this will jump to the label when there is an error. So let's look at these and see why exactly we use them. So let's have a look at the first error again. So we run the code and we get the error and it stops on the line. Now if you're writing very basic code, you're just playing around with a macro or something, then it's absolutely fine if the errors just stop on a line like this. But once your application is going to be distributed to other users, or you're going to write a fairly sizable application, then it's very important to have proper error handling in place. So the problem with code like this is that it looks like the application doesn't work at all. So for example, imagine we have a button like this, and we're going to click on the button to run the code. So the user has this application, they click on create report, and the next thing they've got this up, they click on debug, and all they know is that it's stopped in the code. Now to a user that doesn't know anything about programming, this looks like a catastrophic error, and they'll raise this as a very high error to fix. And this means that you'll have to go kind of figure it all out and try to fix it. Whereas if you have proper error handling in place, the error handling can actually help point the user in the right direction. So we'll see a bit more about that later. So the second error state that we have is onError resume next. So onError resume next is a really bad idea in most situations because you're basically saying ignore the error. If the error gets ignored, we run into a big problem because further down the line it's going to cause issues. Our application isn't going to work correctly. Now there is kind of small scenarios where we use onError resume next, and that's if, for example, we want to hide the error because we're going to deal with it anyway. So imagine we do, like the error we had already, sheet as worksheet, and then we set sheet equal to, and we can say this workbook.worksheets, and we'll say a sheet called sheet 5, we'll say, for example. So we're looking to assign to a sheet called sheet 5. Now we've said onError resume next, so that means ignore the error, but then directly after that line we're saying if sheet is nothing, then print an error, then like could not find worksheet, otherwise it will just continue on as normal. So onError resume next, set sheet, the sheet equals nothing, but the error doesn't get thrown, and then it could not find a worksheet. It writes out that error and then continues on. So there's some scenarios we use it, but most of the time we avoid using it. And one thing is you should be very careful. Now once we use it in this scenario, as well as that, we should always turn back on our error handling. So onError go to EH. So if the next line has an error, for example, then what will happen is, so say for example, dim total as long, and total equals, and again we'll say just a bit of text, and we run this code down to here, it's given the error, and then afterwards it says total as, and then it throws the error. So very important to turn it back on. So we've looked at on error resume next, and we've looked at on error go to 0. So now let's look at on error go to EH, as this is what the real error handling is all about. The easiest way to understand error handling is to look at a really practical example. So here we have some very basic data, and what we're going to do is read through the data, and any time we find the volume where we multiply the volume by 2 and it's below 100, we want to write out the customer name. So very simple code really. So this is the code here. Let's put a breakpoint here and let's run the code so we can see exactly what's happening. So we click on create report. We get the range, we step through the range. If the value is under 100, then we print out the result. And you can see we run it on and it prints out the names of the customers where the value is less than 100. Now the problem is, imagine a user comes along and the user accidentally changes volume to AAA, so it's no longer a number. So when we run our code now, the code gives us a type mismatch. So what happens is it just jumps down to here and then we get the type mismatch error. Now the problem with this is that the code is marginally better than stopping in the code. So if it stops in the code, as I said, it's not very nice at all. If that error happens, or if we think that it could happen, we can deal with it in one way. We can say, okay, let's put in an if statement here and let's check if that cell is numeric. And so we can put the value in here and we can say if it's numeric, then, and that equals false, so it's not numeric, then let's do something, and then otherwise let's continue on and check it. Now you can see there's a big problem with this code, and the problem is that it's going to slow down what we're doing, because every time we read from a cell we have to check from a cell, and we could have like 100,000 cells, so that's going to double the time that we need. So what we need is a better solution, and the better solution is this. We basically just run the code as normal, and if an error happens, then we deal with it. If an error doesn't happen, we just run the code as normal. So this is a really nice solution. So in VBA, when an error occurs, we have what's called the error object. Now we've seen already that when an error happens, error.description gives us the description of the error. And we also have error.number, and error.number gives us the number. Now the number for the type mismatch is 13. So what we can do is, when an error occurs, we can check if it's type mismatch. And if it is type mismatch, then we can handle it. So we can, if it's not, we can just say, okay, just handle it as normal. And when the error occurs, then we can say something like error in cell, and we can even specify what the cell is by just saying the address of the cell, and we do address here. So error in cell, and we could put in more stuff. We can say stuff like please change the value and run the code again, or something like that. So we can get really creative, like when we're running it professionally. So let's go back and try and create a report, and it says error in cell D2, and I would say something like please change the value and run again. Now the user can see straight away, oh, there's a problem in D2, let's fix that problem, and then they run the code again and it will run fine. So for example, they go here, they say, okay, let's change, the value should have been 99 actually. Let's create our report, and then everything fine. They get the values that they wanted. And again, if someone comes along and accidentally makes a change, they click on create report and it tells them exactly where the error is. We can get more creative. We could put in the worksheet in the workbook if required as well. So this is really good because when the error happens, the user can fix it himself. Now, it's also very useful if you're working on code and you haven't seen it in a long time and the code worked, then you suddenly run it and the code doesn't work. If you just get like a subscript out of range error, or you get type mismatch error, you don't really know why the error occurred. But if you get an error like this that tells you exactly what the problem was, then you can go and solve it very quickly. So you can see there's a lot of benefits to using correct error handling. One very important thing we must do when writing professional code is we must clean up after us. So what it means is that if we open files or if we're connecting to the network or something like this, we should always close the connections or close the files when we're finished with them. Because if we don't, it can cause problems when we try to run the code again. And also for a user, if they run your code and suddenly they've loads of workbooks open on their desktop, then it looks very, very unprofessional and it may really cause them a lot of annoyance. Cleaning up is very important. Now, it gets a bit tricky because what happens when we've got an error? So let's have a look at this code. It's very, very simple. What we're doing is we're getting the file name, we're opening a workbook, so the workbook's opened, and then we read from the worksheet. So the worksheet 2018. So there is one for 2018, prints out the value. So it prints out the value, the name is set fields in the value. And then it closes the workbook. So everything is fine. But just imagine that now we're looking for 2019 in this workbook and it doesn't exist. Again, we run through the code. Let's just get it straight down to where the problem is. It's opened the workbook and then suddenly it jumps, gives us the error, but it's left the workbook open. So now we've got a problem that hasn't cleaned up. What we do in this scenario is we can basically put our cleanup code just before the error here. And then what we can do is if error number does not equal 0, then it will report the error. Now if it does equal 0, it doesn't do anything. So we'll run the code again so we can see exactly what happens. So there is an error, it jumps down to EH. First thing it does is it closes the report and then it goes about looking at the error. So it's cleaned up already and then it's just checking if there's an error, and if there's an error it reports it. So let's change the code so there isn't an error and we can see exactly what happens. We run the code, there isn't an error, prints out what it should print out, then it closes the workbook and then it doesn't do the error, it just jumps over the error and then it finishes. So that's how we deal with cleaning up if we need to do it. Now in a lot of cases we don't need to do it, but in certain cases we do, and this is how we deal with it. So one thing that can be a bit tricky sometimes is that we have the error handling code in place, but then when it fires the error, we don't know exactly what line the error happened on. So for example, in this case, we're looking at 19. Imagine we've got a lot of code, and what happens is we run the code and the code gives out the error. Now that's perfectly fine for the user, but when we want to see exactly the line with the error, we don't want to have to disable all our on Error Goto EH, so we don't want to have to go and change all our code. So what we can do is go back to our Tools, Options, General, and this time we click Break on All Errors. So Break on All Errors will ignore any error handling. So we run the code and it basically says subscript out of range. We click on debug and we find the line with the error, and then we can work on fixing it. And then when we fixed it, make sure that we remember to do Tools, Options, General, and put it back to the normal break on unhandled errors. So this is very, very useful if you have the code yourself and you just want to turn off the error handling just to get to the root of the error. So there's one more issue that we have to look at, and that is the unwind. So everything we've done so far, it's fine because we're just in one sub. But what happens is, let's say we create a report, and in our create report we call, and we'll say this one is reading data. So we'll say this one does read data, and we call read data, and then after we read the data, we write the data somewhere. So we have a sub write data. So far so good. So the problem is that if we have an error in the code, what happens is, now we're running from create, we have the error in the code and it says subscript out of range, that's all fine. But what happens is we come up into create report and our code is going to keep going. So it's going to keep going because the error was in the sub below it and now it's just come back out. So how do we deal with that? Now we could return a value, say -1, which was done in the old days, and then we check for all the return values. And if the return value is say -1, we don't go in to write data. But this kind of error handling is real messy, because basically if you forget one if statement, then it doesn't work. And the second thing is it makes the code really ugly, because your normal code is mixed up with all this error handling code rather than being kept apart when we're using on Error Goto statements. So the way that we can do it is two different ways. We can do an on error at the very top, but the problem with the on error at the very top is that it gives us back an error. We don't really know where the error was, and it can be a bit tricky to find. Now there's a second method that I use, and I've created the code to do it. So all you've got to do is add it into your own code. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend an entire video on that. So the next video that I release is going to be on an error handling strategy that you can take and add to your code. And this error handling strategy is really good, because what it does is it actually gets back the line number with the error if you want. And what I'm going to do is give a brief recap on what we've just done. So let's have a brief recap on error handling. The first thing we should understand about error handling is that we should have the setting break on handle errors set, or otherwise our error handling code won't work. Now the second thing is we should always use debug compile before we run our code, so this helps us remove all compile errors. There's 3 types of errors in VBA, and we're always in one of these error states. Now we set the error states by using on Error Goto. We should avoid using the resume next statement, so after an error happens we can say resume next and the code will continue on the line after the error. But as I said, this is not really a good thing to do, because once an error occurs, our code is generally unstable. The error objects contain the details of the error, so they contain the number and they contain the description, and we can interrogate the number and use it then to write code based on the type of error that occurs. Once an error occurs, we should add code to handle it the next time. So we saw that with the type mismatch. If this type of error occurs, we put in type mismatch code, and the next time it happens gives the user a very nice description of what happens. So as I said, in the next video, what I'm going to do is provide a nice strategy that you can easily add in your own code to have error handling. And it's very, very simple to use. Now, if you like this video, please click on the like button. And if you want to hear more about my videos, then click on the subscribe button. And don't forget to get the free cheat sheet, which is in the description below. Just click on the link. Now, if you've got any comments, questions or queries about error handling or about this video in general, then please add them to the comments section below. I hope to see you on the next video.